The decision was delivered on October 14th, 1876. It came without sentiment, a pronouncement as cold and hard as the granite peaks that loomed over the town of Providence Flats. Elara Vance stood before the town council, a tribunal of 3 men whose faces were etched with the certainty of their own righteousness. Silas Croft, the banker who held the deeds to half the valley, spoke the words. He did not look at her. "In light of the outstanding debts of your late husband, Jacob Vance," he declared, his voice a dry rustle of paper and coin, "the council finds it necessary to reclaim the property, the cabin, and the associated 160 acres as collateral." He paused, adjusting his spectacles. "The debt amounts to $112. The property's assessed value is $105. The town is being generous." Generous. The word hung in the air of the small, stuffy town hall, a place that smelled of stale tobacco and self-congratulation. Elara felt a hollowness spread through her chest, an emptiness colder than the autumn wind rattling the window panes. Jacob had been dead for 6 weeks, his life ended by a falling ponderosa pine, a freak accident in the woods that had stolen the breath from her own lungs. She was a widow. She was an orphan. She was 19 years old. Reverend Miller, a man whose piety was exceeded only by his girth, cleared his throat. "It is a sad providence, Elara, a test of your faith, but the laws of man, like the laws of God, must be respected. Order must be maintained." The third man, Jedodiah Stone, the master carpenter who had built nearly every structure in town, remained silent. He simply stroked his gray beard and stared at the floorboards, his hands, thick and calloused, resting on his knees. He had been Jacob's friend. He had taught Jacob how to swing an axe. His silence was the cruelest blow of all. They were not throwing her out into the wilderness entirely. That would have been an act of overt cruelty. And these were men who preferred their cruelty veiled in procedure and law. Croft produced another document. "The town, in its charity, offers you the use of the old trapper's shack down by Whisper Creek. It is on unclaimed land, but we will overlook the squatting for the season." For the season. The words meant, until the spring thaw, if you survive. The old trapper's shack was a ruin, a collection of rotting planks and chinking that had fallen out years ago. It was considered less a dwelling and more a landmark for where the valley trail met the creek. No one had lived in it for a decade. It was a place for porcupines and decay. Elara did not plead. She did not weep. The grief for Jacob had scoured her clean of tears. She met Silas Croft's gaze for the first time, her own eyes a clear, steady gray. "I see," she said. The 2 words were all she could offer, a small, hard stone of acknowledgement cast against a wall of indifference. She turned and walked out of the town hall, the door closing behind her with a definitive click. Her life in Providence Flats, the life she had built with Jacob, was over. A new one, a desperate one, had just begun. The shack was worse than she remembered. It stood canted to one side as if exhausted. The roof, a patchwork of split cedar and hope, was riddled with holes. The single window was a gaping void, its glass long shattered. Inside, the space was no more than 12 feet by 14 feet. There was no floor, only packed earth already damp and cold to the touch. The wind, a harbinger of the coming winter, whistled through 100 gaps in the walls. Her worldly possessions consisted of a single cart, a cast-iron stove, a bedroll, a box of kitchen implements, Jacob's tools, and a small leather-bound book filled with her grandmother's spidery script. That first night, she slept fitfully, wrapped in every blanket she owned, the cold seeping up from the ground and into her bones. The frost came before dawn, painting the dead grass in strokes of silver and turning her breath into a cloud of white vapor. She knew, with a certainty that was absolute, that she would not survive a winter in this place. Not as it was. The cold would creep in, settle in the dirt floor, and turn the very ground she slept on into a block of ice. It would leach the warmth from her body faster than any fire could replenish it. The men of the council expected her to fail. They expected her to come crawling back to the church, begging for a place as a scullery maid, or to simply pack her meager belongings and walk the 40 miles to the next settlement, a journey that was already becoming treacherous. They saw a young, bereaved woman, alone and helpless. They did not see the granddaughter of Anya Petrova, a woman who had survived 3 winters on the Siberian steppe with nothing but a knife and the knowledge passed down through her bloodline. On the morning of October 16th, Alara took Jacob's shovel and pickaxe and walked the perimeter of her new, pathetic domain. The shack was situated on a gentle slope, about 50 yards from the bank of Whisper Creek. The creek was not wide, but it was deep and fast-moving, fed by a mountain spring that never froze entirely, even in the deepest cold. She looked from the creek to the shack, her eyes narrowed in thought. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, a low, steady murmur from a childhood spent at her knee. "The earth has 2 hearts, Alara," the old woman used to say, "the fiery heart deep below, and the warm heart just beneath the frost. The earth gives warmth if you know how to ask." An idea, radical and born of desperation, began to form. It was a concept her grandmother had called a Teplavoy corridor, a warmth corridor. It was a principle laughed at by the modern builders with their newfangled science, but one Anya had sworn by. The principle was simple. Deep earth and moving water held a constant, latent warmth, a temperature that hovered just above freezing, regardless of the air temperature above. If one could channel that stable air, that gentle breath of the deep earth, into a dwelling, one could prevent the ground itself from freezing. One could create a floor that never fell below 35 degrees Fahrenheit. Her plan was audacious. She would dig a trench. Not a foundation trench, but a long, deep channel running from beneath the center of the shack, downslope, all the way into the gravelly bed of Whisper Creek itself. This trench would act as a subterranean lung. It would have to be deep, far below the frost line, which in these mountains could reach 6 feet. The trench would draw in the stable, warmer air from the deep soil and the creek bed, channeling it into a plenum, a sealed air gap she would build beneath a new wooden floor in the shack. The colder, denser air inside the shack would, by the simple laws of thermodynamics, sink and be pushed out through a second, smaller vent, creating a slow, constant, passive circulation of geothermally warmed air. It was a tremendous amount of work, a task for a team of strong men, not a lone woman with a shovel. It was a gamble against time, against the coming snows, against the skepticism of an entire town. But as she stood there, the cold wind pulling at her shawl, she felt not despair, but a flicker of grim resolve. They had left her with nothing but dirt and a ruin. She would use that dirt to save her own life. She began that very day. Her first task was to acquire the necessary supplies. She walked back into Providence Flats, her head held high, ignoring the curious and pitying stares. She went not to Silas Croft's bank, but to the general store. There, she sold the last item of value she possessed, a small gold locket Jacob had given her, with a tiny, pressed edelweiss inside. She received $7 for it. It felt like selling a part of her heart. With the money, she purchased 20 rough-sawn pine planks, 10 feet long and 1 foot wide, and a box of nails. She also bought 3 lengths of 6-inch diameter terracotta drainage pipe, the kind used for culverts. The total cost was $6.52. She had $1.48 left to her name. She arranged for the materials to be delivered by cart to the edge of town, as she could not afford the extra fee for delivery to the shack itself. The next morning, before the sun had cleared the eastern ridge, she began to dig. She started inside the shack, marking out a rectangle 3 feet wide and 8 feet long in the center of the dirt floor. The topsoil was soft, but a foot down she hit a dense layer of clay and rock. The work was brutal. Each swing of the pickaxe sent a jarring shock up her arms. Each shovelful of heavy, damp earth was a monumental effort. She worked with a methodical rhythm, a pace born of endurance, not strength. She learned to use the weight of her body, not just her arms. She filled a bucket, carried it outside, dumped it, and returned. Over and over. The pile of excavated earth grew slowly, a testament to her unyielding labor. It was on the 3rd day of digging that she received her first visitors. Jedodiah Stone and Reverend Miller appeared at the doorway of the shack, their shadows falling long across the dirt floor. Alara was waist-deep in the hole, her face smudged with dirt, her hair tied back in a messy bun. "Good heavens, child!" Reverend Miller exclaimed, his face a mask of patronizing concern. "What is the meaning of this? Are you digging an indoor root cellar?" Alara paused, resting one hand on the handle of the shovel. "I am improving my foundation, Reverend." Jedodiah Stone stepped inside, his experienced eyes scanning the hole, the pile of dirt, the new planks stacked against the wall. He grunted, a sound of profound disapproval. "This is no foundation, girl. A foundation needs to be under the walls, not in the middle of the floor. You're digging a sump pit. You'll have this whole shack filled with water come spring." "The trench will run downhill to the creek," Alara explained, her voice even and calm. "It is for air, not water." Jedodiah scoffed. "Air? What foolishness is this? You need a good stove and a cord of seasoned oak, not a hole in the ground to let the cold in." He kicked at a loose clod of dirt. "This is woman's folly. You don't know the first thing about building. Jacob, bless his soul, he would have known better." The mention of Jacob's name was a deliberate cruelty, a reminder of her loss and her supposed helplessness. But Alara did not flinch. "My grandmother taught me some things," she said quietly. "Old wives' tales and superstition," Reverend Miller interjected, shaking his head sadly. "The Lord provides for us through honest work and sound principles, Alara, not by burrowing in the earth like a badger. I urge you, cease this strange labor. Come to the church. The congregation will find you a place. Mrs. Croft needs help in her kitchen." It was the offer they had expected her to accept from the beginning, an offer of servitude disguised as charity. "Thank you for your concern, Reverend," Alara said, turning back to her work. "But I will see this through." She drove the shovel into the hard-packed clay, the scraping sound filling the silence. The two men exchanged a look of mingled pity and exasperation. They saw a stubborn, foolish girl, grieving and addled, digging her own grave. They left without another word. The encounter only hardened her resolve. For the next 2 weeks, she worked from dawn until dusk. The trench grew, a raw, deep scar extending from the shack's interior down the gentle slope towards the creek. The labor was agonizing. Her hands, soft from a life of keeping a home, became a landscape of blisters that burst, bled, and hardened into thick calluses. Her back screamed in protest each morning when she rose from her bedroll. She ate sparingly, some dried beans, a little flour mixed with water and cooked on her small stove. Every muscle ached, but with each foot of progress, a grim satisfaction took root. She was not succumbing. She was fighting back with the only weapons she had: her body, Jacob's tools, and Anya's wisdom. The trench had to be precise. The floor of it needed a consistent, gentle slope, a gradient of about 1 inch for every 10 feet, to ensure the air would flow naturally without assistance. She used a long, straight plank and a spirit level from Jacob's toolbox, meticulously checking the angle every few feet. When she reached a depth of 8 feet, well below the frost line, she began digging horizontally, extending the trench towards the creek. The soil here was different, sandier, and shot through with river stones. It was easier to dig, but more prone to collapse. She worked carefully, shoring up the sides with some of the planks she had intended for the floor. By mid-November, the trench was complete. It stretched for 67 feet, a subterranean passage from the heart of her home to the edge of the water. The final, most dangerous part, was tunneling through the last few feet of the creek bank. She worked in the frigid water, digging away the earth until she could lay the last piece of terracotta pipe, its opening protected by a small grate of woven wire to keep out rodents and debris. The opening was positioned just above the winter water line, but deep within the thermally stable mass of the creek bank. Now, she began the second phase, constructing the conduit. She laid the 3 sections of terracotta pipe in the section of the trench nearest the creek, ensuring a snug fit. For the rest of the length, she could not afford more pipe. Instead, she used a technique her grandmother had described. She carefully lined the bottom of the trench with flat, overlapping stones she gathered from the creek bed. Then, she built low, parallel walls of larger stones along the trench's length, creating a channel about 8 inches wide and a foot high. For the top of this channel, she used more flat stones, creating a rustic but effective subterranean aqueduct for air. She worked with intense focus, her hands raw from handling the cold, wet stones. Once the stone-lined conduit was complete, she covered it with a thick layer of coarse gravel, also hauled bucket by bucket from the creek. This gravel layer would allow air to permeate but prevent the finer soil from clogging the channel. Finally, she began the laborious process of backfilling the entire trench, returning the mountain of earth she had excavated back into the ground, tamping it down firmly with her feet and the back of her shovel. When she was finished, the only visible signs of her Herculean effort were a long, slightly raised mound of earth stretching to the creek and the open end of the conduit inside her cabin. The final stage of the project was inside the shack itself. Over the opening of the trench, she built a shallow, rectangular pit, a plenum chamber, about 2 feet deep. She lined it with some of the remaining planks to create a sealed box. She then laid down wood. She left a small grated opening at one end of the floor, directly over the plenum, and another small vent near the wall at the opposite end of the cabin. Her system was complete. The slightly warmer air from the subterranean conduit would rise into the plenum, circulate in the sealed space beneath the floorboards, and push the colder, heavier air out through the far vent. Her last task was to insulate the shack itself. She spent a week cutting thick bricks of sod from the tough prairie grass, stacking them against the exterior walls until they were banked up to the roofline. She used a mixture of clay and grass to chink the countless gaps between the wall planks. She repaired the roof using salvaged tins and tar she bought with her last few cents. By the time the first snows fell on December 2nd, the dilapidated trapper's shack had been transformed. From the outside, it looked like a humble mound of earth, a part of the landscape itself. Inside, it was a small, tight, secure shelter. The first true test came a week later. A cold snap descended on the valley, plunging temperatures to 10 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. In Providence Flats, the townsfolk stoked their fires high, the columns of smoke rising straight into the still, frigid air. Inside their conventionally built cabins, floors were icy cold, and drafts snaked in around windows and doors. In Alara's shack, the air was cool, but not cold. A small fire in her stove was enough to keep the interior temperature at a comfortable 55 degrees. The true miracle was the floor. She knelt and placed her palm flat against the wood. It was cool to the touch, but it was not the life-leeching, bone-deep cold of frozen earth. She could feel a faint, almost imperceptible current of air rising from the grate. It was not warm air, but it was air that was 38 degrees instead of 10 below zero. Her grandmother's theories were not folly. They were fact. The earth was breathing warmth into her home. Her solitary existence continued. She saw no one. She chopped her own firewood from deadfall near the creek, but she needed far less than anyone else. She had set snares and caught a few rabbits, and her small supply of flour and beans was lasting longer than she had hoped. She spent her days reading her grandmother's book, mending her clothes, and feeling a quiet, deep sense of satisfaction. She had faced the judgment of the town and the fury of nature, and she was prevailing. The town did not forget her. They simply assumed the inevitable. "The poor girl won't last till Christmas," Silas Croft was heard to remark at the general store. "It's a tragedy, but she was too proud to accept help." Jedodiah Stone agreed. "That shack has no proper foundation. The frost will heave it apart by January. And digging that ditch, she probably flooded the whole place." Their pronouncements were made with the unshakable confidence of men who had never been wrong. Their words were accepted as fact by the rest of the townsfolk. Alara Vance was a ghost, already consigned to a grim, frozen fate. The dramatic irony was a shield she wore, unknowingly, against the coming storm. The storm began on the evening of January 18th, 1877. It did not arrive with the fury of a normal blizzard, but with a strange, silent intensity. The snow fell not in flakes, but in tiny, hard pellets that hissed against the roof. The sky turned a bruised, slate gray, and the temperature began to plummet. By morning, Providence Flats was buried under 2 feet of snow, and it was still falling. The wind began to pick up, a low moan that grew into a shrieking gale, sculpting the accumulating snow into massive, impassable drifts. This was no ordinary winter storm. This was a force of nature, a meteorological anomaly that would later be known in regional annals as the Great White Death. For 3 days, the storm raged without pause. The temperature dropped to 20, then 30, then an almost inconceivable 42 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. The wind howled at over 50 miles per hour, creating a wind chill factor that was instantly lethal to any exposed skin. Providence Flats was completely and utterly isolated, a handful of wooden boxes being slowly crushed by the immense power of the Arctic vortex. Inside their homes, the people of the town fought a desperate, losing battle against the cold. The log walls, so sturdy in summer, offered little resistance to such a profound frost. The chinking between the logs contracted, opening up tiny fissures for the wind to knife through. The single-pane glass windows were coated in inches of thick, opaque ice. The primary enemy, however, was the floor. The ground beneath their cabins was frozen solid to a depth of several feet, and that cold radiated upwards relentlessly. It made the air near the floor dozens of degrees colder than the air near the ceiling. Families huddled together on their beds, wrapped in every blanket they owned, feeding their stoves with a frantic desperation. Wood piles, meant to last for weeks, vanished in days. The seasoned hardwood burned hot and fast, but the heat it generated rose directly to the ceiling and was sucked out through drafty chimneys, while the cold held dominion below. Soon, people began burning furniture. A chair, a wardrobe, a kitchen table, All were sacrificed to the hungry flames in a futile attempt to keep the killing cold at bay. In Silas Croft's large two-story house, the biggest in town, the situation was dire. Despite having two massive fireplaces and a large cast-iron stove, the downstairs rooms were uninhabitable. The family, including his wife and two young children, were confined to a single upstairs bedroom. They had burned through their entire woodshed and were now breaking up the guest room furniture. The fear in the house was a palpable thing, colder even than the air. Croft, the man of finance and order, was helpless. His money, his deeds, his influence, they were all worthless against the implacable physics of the cold. Reverend Miller's faith was being tested as never before. He prayed constantly, his pleas lost in the howl of the wind. His wife was ill, her breathing shallow and ragged in the frigid air of their bedroom. They had run out of firewood entirely and were burning books from his library, the works of theologians and philosophers turning to ash in a desperate search for a few more minutes of warmth. He prayed for deliverance, but the storm only intensified. Jedodiah Stone, the master builder, faced the ultimate indictment of his life's work. His own home, which he had always boasted was the tightest and best built in the valley, was failing him. He knew the principles of construction, of tight joinery and solid foundations, but his knowledge was conventional. It had never accounted for a cold this profound, this persistent. His floor was a sheet of ice. The nails in the walls contracted with loud pops, and the timbers groaned under the immense pressure of the cold. He looked at his wife and son, their faces blue and pinched, and felt a shame that burned hotter than his dwindling fire. All his pride, all his expertise, had come to nothing. He had built coffins. It was on the morning of the fourth day that the desperation in Jedodiah Stone's house reached its peak. Their fire was out. The last of the burnable furniture was gone. The temperature inside the main room was below zero. His son was no longer shivering. A dangerous lethargy had set in. It was then that a strange, half-mad thought entered his mind. He thought of the girl. The foolish, stubborn girl in the trapper's shack. He had predicted her demise with such certainty. He imagined her frozen solid, a monument to her own folly. But what if? The question was a tiny, irrational spark in the cold darkness of his mind. What if she had known something he did not? "I'm going out," he announced, his voice hoarse. His wife stared at him, her eyes wide with terror. "You can't! Jedodiah, you will die in seconds!" "We will die in here if I do nothing," he replied, his voice grim. "I'm going to the Croft house. We need to pool our resources." It was a lie, but it was the only thing he could say. He could not admit the true, insane purpose of his mission. He bundled himself in every layer of clothing he owned, wrapping his face in wool until only his eyes were visible. He took a rope and tied one end to his porch railing. He would play it out as he went. It was his only hope of finding his way back. Stepping outside was like stepping onto another planet. The wind was a physical blow, stealing his breath and driving ice crystals into his eyes. The world was a churning maelstrom of white. He could not see more than 5 feet in any direction. He stumbled through drifts that were over his head, pulling himself along with the rope, his lungs burning with every gasp of super-chilled air. He did not go towards Croft's house. He turned in the opposite direction, towards the creek, towards the girl's shack. The journey of less than half a mile took him nearly an hour. He fell a dozen times, losing all sense of direction, relying only on the slight downward slope of the land. He was on the verge of collapse, his body screaming, his mind numb with cold, when he bumped into something solid, a wall. He brushed away the snow and felt the rough texture of sawed bricks. He had found it. The shack looked less like a building and more like a natural drift, a part of the snow-covered earth. There was no smoke coming from the small stovepipe chimney. His heart sank. He had been right. She was dead. Still, some desperate instinct drove him on. He found the door, buried under a deep eave of snow, and pushed. It was not frozen shut. It swung inward. He stumbled inside, falling to his knees, and pulled the door closed against the raging storm. The contrast was so profound it was disorienting. The roar of the wind was instantly muted, replaced by a deep, enveloping quiet. And there was warmth. It was not the baking heat of a roaring fire, but a gentle, steady, life-sustaining warmth. The air was still and calm. A single candle flickered on a small table, and in its soft light, he saw her. Alara Vance was sitting in a chair, wrapped in a simple woolen shawl, reading her grandmother's book. A small kettle on the tiny stove let out a faint wisp of steam. She looked up, her expression not of surprise, but of calm expectation. Jedodiah Stone stared, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. He pulled the wool wrap from his face, his beard caked in ice. He looked at the floor, the simple, unadorned pine planks. He looked at the walls, free of frost. He looked at the small pile of firewood next to the stove, a pile that was barely diminished. He reached out a trembling, gloved hand and touched the floor. It was cool, but it was a living cool, not the dead cold of the grave. "How?" he rasped, the single word a croak of disbelief. "The earth," Alara said simply. "The earth is keeping us warm." Jedodiah's mind, the mind of a builder, a man who understood structure and stress and materials, reeled. He saw the grated vent near the floor. He remembered her talk of a trench, of air. The foolishness he had mocked, the woman's folly he had dismissed. It was a work of genius. A genius that was keeping her alive and comfortable while he and the rest of the town were freezing to death in their solid, respectable, ignorant homes. "My family," he choked out, shame and desperation warring in his voice. "My boy, he's freezing." Alara closed her book and stood. "Then go and bring them here," she said, her voice devoid of triumph or accusation. It was a simple statement of fact. This place was safe. It was a sanctuary. Jedodiah Stone, the master builder of Providence Flats, did not hesitate. He nodded, a single jerky motion of his head, and turned to plunge back into the storm. But this time, he was not driven by a mad, desperate hope. He was driven by the certainty of salvation. He followed his rope back to his house, his mind ablaze with the miracle he had witnessed. He burst into his own frozen home and found his wife huddled over their son, weeping. "Get your coats," he commanded, his voice ringing with an authority she had not heard in days. "We are leaving. I have found shelter." He led his family back through the blizzard, following the rope, a lifeline to Alara's shack. They were not the only ones. As he had struggled through the town, he had hammered on the doors of the Miller and Croft houses, screaming his discovery into the wind. He had found Silas Croft and Reverend Miller in a state of near total collapse, their families on the verge of succumbing to hypothermia. Humbled by a terror that transcended pride, they too gathered their loved ones and followed Jedodiah Stone into the White Fury. One by one, the families of the men who had condemned Alara Vance stumbled into her tiny, earth-warmed home. Silas Croft, the banker. Reverend Miller, the spiritual guide. Jedodiah Stone, the master builder. They brought their wives and their children, their faces etched with frostbite and disbelief. They crowded into the small space, a huddled mass of shivering refugees. Not one of them had lost a family member, a miracle in itself. Not one had burned through their wood supply with such profligate futility as she had conserved hers. And not one of them, in that moment, would admit they had been so profoundly, catastrophically wrong. Ilara accepted them without a word of reproach. She brewed tea. She shared the small amount of rabbit stew she had left. She made a space for the children closest to the stove. Her small 12 by 14-foot shack, the ruin they had sentenced her to, became an ark. For 2 more days the storm raged, and inside that tiny haven, surrounded by the warmth of the earth, 17 people survived. They survived because of the wisdom of an old woman from the Siberian steppe and the courage and labor of the young woman they had cast out. When the storm finally broke on the 5th day, the sun rose on a world transformed. The sky was a brilliant, painful blue, and the snow lay in immense, silent drifts of pristine white. Providence Flats looked like a graveyard of tiny white hills. From the mound of Ilara's shack, the survivors emerged, blinking in the bright light. The air was still and brutally cold, but the wind was gone. The walk back to their homes was a somber pilgrimage. The town was devastated. They found their cabins filled with a killing cold that would take days to banish. Worse, they found that not everyone had been as fortunate. 3 families, 8 people in total, including 2 children, had perished in their homes, frozen solid in their beds. They had died in houses built on sound principles with proper foundations, while the town's most powerful men had survived in a dirt-banked shack with a hole in the floor. The reckoning came 2 days later, in the town hall, the same room where Ilara had been sentenced. This time, the entire surviving population of Providence Flats was present. It was Silas Croft who stood before them, his face pale and drawn. He did not look at his ledgers or his deeds. He looked directly at Ilara Vance, who stood at the back of the room. "I have been a fool," he said, his voice cracking. "We have all been fools. We valued our pride and our traditions over common sense and wisdom. We sent this young woman to what we believed was her death, and in our arrogance, we nearly met that fate ourselves." He took a deep breath. "Ilara Vance saved my children. She saved my wife. She saved me. The debt of Jacob Vance is hereby canceled. The deed to his land and cabin are returned to her, effective immediately. It is a pitifully small restitution for what she has given us." Then Reverend Miller stood, his face a ruin of shame. The Bible speaks of the wisdom of the humble and the foolishness of the proud. I preached those words without understanding them. I offered charity when I should have offered respect. I saw a hole in the ground and called it folly, when in fact it was an act of profound faith. Not in my God, perhaps, but in the laws of his creation. I ask for her forgiveness and his. Finally, Jedodiah Stone, his face grim, he walked to the front of the room. He turned to the assembled men. "For 20 years, I have built the houses in this valley, and in the greatest test, they failed. They were tombs. I built with timber and nails, but I forgot the most important material, the earth itself. The structure that saved us, the one I mocked, was built with knowledge I did not possess." He then turned to Ilara, his eyes meeting hers with a raw, newfound reverence. "I ask you, Mistress Vance," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "teach me how you did it. Teach us all." And so she did. That spring, as the great melt began and the valley slowly came back to life, Ilara Vance's dilapidated shack became a school. The builders and farmers of Providence Flats came not to offer charity, but to learn. With Jacob's tools, she showed them the principles of the warmth corridor. She explained thermal mass, the frost line, and the constant, giving temperature of the deep earth. She drew diagrams in the dirt, explaining the physics of passive air circulation with a clarity that belied her years. They retrofitted their own homes, digging trenches, creating plenums beneath their floors, and banking their walls with the sod of the earth. They worked together, a community humbled and reborn from the crucible of the Great White Death. Ilara moved back into her home with Jacob, its foundation now secured by the new, old knowledge. She was no longer the outcast, the poor widow. She was the sage of Whisper Creek, the woman who listened to the earth. Her vindication was complete, written not in laws or ledgers, but in the very foundations of a town that had learned, at a terrible cost, that the deepest wisdom is often buried, waiting only for someone with the courage to dig.